December 1944. Somewhere inside Germany, Edward R. Kirkland had already become a number. The paperwork said captured. The Luftwaffe guards processed him with the efficiency of men who had done this thousands of times before. His dog tags were recorded. His name was written into a ledger. His flight suit marked him clearly as an American airman now held behind German wire. For the Germans, this was routine. Since the beginning of the war, tens of thousands of Allied pilots had passed through the same system. They were interrogated, cataloged, and transported to prison camps designed specifically for men like Kirkland. None of them walked out. Now Kirkland stood on the ground where his war was supposed to end. He had no weapon, no map, no radio. Only the cold wind pressing through his thin flight suit and the certainty that he was hundreds of miles from friendly territory. To anyone watching, the conclusion seemed obvious. His part in the war was finished. But the Germans could not record what was already happening inside his mind. Captivity in late war Europe followed a predictable pattern. The Luftwaffe had spent years perfecting the process of handling captured Allied airmen. Their system was built to eliminate hope before a prisoner ever reached the barbed wire. The first weapon was shock. One moment a pilot controlled a machine capable of flying faster than anything on the ground. The next he stood helpless in a field surrounded by armed men who had every reason to hate him. That transition alone broke many prisoners. Kirkland felt it too. His P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft that had carried him safely through dozens of missions, was gone. Destroyed somewhere in the German countryside after the damage that had forced him down. The machine that had been his protection had vanished. All that remained was his training. The guards who captured him knew exactly what he represented. A single American fighter pilot required months of training and enormous resources. Flight school, advanced instruction, combat experience gained through dangerous missions over occupied Europe. Every captured pilot was a small victory against the relentless bombing campaign being carried out by the U.S. 8th Air Force. The Germans searched him carefully. Anything that might help him escape disappeared immediately. The small compass hidden inside a uniform button. The silk map sewn into his jacket lining. Currency and escape aids concealed in his boots. German intelligence officers had spent years studying Allied escape equipment. They knew every trick. By the time the search was finished, Kirkland possessed almost nothing. Just the clothes he wore, and the knowledge inside his head. Captured airmen were moved through a chain of holding facilities before being delivered to permanent prison camps. Each transfer theoretically created an opportunity to escape. But in reality, those chances rarely existed. Prisoners were always outnumbered. Guards were experienced. And the German civilian population had been warned to watch for Allied flyers. Many civilians had endured years of bombing. Their anger toward American airmen ran deep. For a lone prisoner far from Allied lines, the countryside itself could become a trap. No food, no safe houses, no resistance network waiting to guide him home. Only winter, patrols, and hostile territory stretching for hundreds of miles. The logical choice was obvious. Stay alive. Wait. Trust that the Geneva Convention would protect prisoners. Hope that Red Cross food packages arrived. Hope that the war ended before disease or despair did. Thousands of captured Allied pilots had made that decision. They slept in their barracks. They counted the days. They waited for liberation. Kirkland understood the mathematics of captivity just as clearly as they did. He had heard the stories of escape attempts that ended badly. Men shot while trying to run. Men beaten by civilians who turned them over to German authorities. Men who simply disappeared into the prison system, never heard from again. From every rational perspective, escape was impossible. But Kirkland's mind had been trained to work in a particular way. And that training had taught him something important. When everyone else stops looking for solutions, that is often the moment when solutions appear. Edward R. Kirkland came from the America that existed before the war changed everything. Like many young men of his generation, his early life followed a familiar pattern. A childhood shaped by the Great Depression. An education interrupted by the growing reality that the world was sliding toward war. Recruitment posters promised adventure and duty. Newsreels showed aircraft soaring across distant skies. For many young men, the decision came quickly. For Kirkland, it led to the Army Air Forces. The pilot training program during the war was one of the largest technical education efforts in American history. Thousands of candidates entered the system each month. Only those with specific mental traits survived the process. Pilots had to track multiple streams of information simultaneously. They had to make decisions under extreme pressure. They had to adapt instantly when situations changed. Kirkland passed every stage. Primary training introduced him to flight. Basic training sharpened his instrument skills. Advanced training prepared him for aerial combat. But the real transformation happened when he met the aircraft that would define his career. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. The Thunderbolt was a monster. Weighing more than 7 tons when fully loaded, it was the heaviest single-engine fighter of the entire war. Its enormous Pratt & Whitney R-2800 engine generated more than 2,000 horsepower. The aircraft could not outturn German fighters. It could not outclimb them either. But it possessed something else: speed in a dive, and durability beyond anything else in the sky. Pilots who survived in Thunderbolts learned to fight on their own terms. They attacked from altitude, diving at tremendous speed. They struck with overwhelming firepower from 8.50 caliber machine guns. Then they climbed back into the sky before the enemy could react. It was brutal, efficient combat, and it demanded constant awareness. A pilot who lost track of his surroundings often died without ever seeing the aircraft that killed him. By the winter of 1944, Kirkland had flown enough missions to become a veteran. He had seen aircraft explode in midair. He had felt his own fighter shudder under enemy fire. He had brought damaged machines home that should never have stayed in the air. Each mission sharpened his instincts. He learned to notice small changes in the sky: a shadow moving where none should exist, a flicker of sunlight off an enemy canopy, the sudden silence of a radio call that never finished. Combat taught him one lesson above all others: survival belonged to the men who kept thinking, even when panic seemed inevitable, even when the situation appeared hopeless. That skill had kept him alive in the sky. Now, standing on the ground in enemy territory with nothing left but his mind, he would need it more than ever. American air superiority over Europe in 1944 had come at an enormous cost. Thousands of aircraft had been destroyed. Tens of thousands of airmen had vanished into the sky or fallen behind enemy lines. Every pilot understood the numbers. Fly enough missions, and the probability eventually caught up with you. Mechanical failure, enemy fighters, flak exploding in black clouds around your aircraft. The sky offered countless ways to die, and luck was never permanent. Edward Kirkland knew that his turn might arrive on any mission. Like every experienced pilot, he prepared for that possibility in small, disciplined ways. Before each sortie, he checked his survival gear carefully. He memorized escape procedures he hoped never to use. He trained his mind to remain calm when everything around him began to collapse. When the moment finally came, he was as prepared as any man could be for a situation no one was truly ready to face. The mission that ended his flying war began like dozens of others. The day started before dawn in a briefing room somewhere in England. Pilots gathered around maps while intelligence officers outlined the target and the expected defenses. Weather reports were discussed. Fighter opposition was estimated. The ritual had been repeated so many times that the movements of the men in the room had become almost automatic. Outside on the cold airfield, ground crews were already preparing the aircraft. Kirkland climbed into the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt, the fighter he had come to trust with his life. Every switch, every gauge, every lever was familiar. He had checked them countless times before. The engine started with the deep rumble unique to the Thunderbolt's massive radial motor. The sound vibrated through the entire airframe, settling into a steady rhythm that promised power and reliability. Soon the aircraft rolled down the runway and lifted into the gray English sky. Formation assembly over England brought the fighter group together in carefully practiced patterns. Dozens of aircraft climbed and arranged themselves across miles of sky, maintaining distance while protecting one another from attack. Each pilot watched his position relative to the others, constantly adjusting to maintain the formation that would carry them across the channel. The crossing itself marked the transition from safety to danger. Below them, the gray waters of the English Channel passed quickly beneath their wings. Beyond that water lay occupied Europe. Every rifle on the ground, every anti-aircraft battery, every German fighter pilot in the sky, all of them were enemies. High above, Long white contrails from bomber formations stretched across the sky like highways made of vapor, evidence of the enormous American air campaign underway. It was a war fought miles above the ground, and it was unforgiving. What exactly brought Kirkland down on that particular mission would never be fully clear. Air combat rarely produced neat explanations. The chaos of battle fractured memory and scattered evidence across miles of sky. The essential fact remained simple. His Thunderbolt was damaged beyond recovery. Perhaps it was flak. Even late in the war, German anti-aircraft defenses remained deadly. Heavy guns fired explosive shells that burst in the air, filling the sky with razor-sharp fragments of metal. Entire formations sometimes flew through corridors of black explosions where luck alone determined survival. Or perhaps it was enemy fighters. Though badly outnumbered, the Luftwaffe still possessed skilled pilots flying dangerous aircraft. They had learned to strike quickly, appearing from the sun or clouds before disappearing again. A short burst of cannon fire could tear through an engine or fuel system in seconds. There was also the possibility of mechanical failure. The Thunderbolt was durable, but every aircraft was still a machine pushed to its limits thousands of times. Eventually, something broke. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. Kirkland suddenly found himself inside an aircraft that was no longer capable of flight. The choices available to him collapsed into a final decision. Stay with the aircraft and attempt a crash landing. Or jump. He chose the parachute. Bailing out of a damaged fighter followed procedures drilled into pilots during training. Canopy release. Harness unlocked. Body thrown clear of the aircraft. In training, the process was controlled and rehearsed. In combat, with adrenaline flooding the body and the aircraft possibly spinning or burning, it was something closer to chaos. The sudden transition from the enclosed cockpit to the open sky was violent. The wind tore at his clothing as he tumbled away from the dying aircraft. Then the parachute opened, and the roar of the engine disappeared. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. For the first time since the mission began, there was no vibration, no mechanical noise. Only wind and the distant rumble of battle somewhere above. Below him stretched the German countryside, fields divided by hedgerows. Small villages clustered around church towers. Thin winter forests scattered across the landscape. From high above, it looked peaceful, but Kirkland knew the truth. Every inch of ground below belonged to the enemy. The descent lasted only a few minutes. 3 minutes to watch the ground slowly rise toward him. 3 minutes to consider the survival kit that had been strapped to his parachute harness. 3 minutes to think about escape procedures he had studied during training. And 3 minutes to understand that the mathematics of the situation offered no easy answers. He was deep inside German-controlled territory, completely alone. The men who came to collect him arrived quickly. German soldiers, possibly civilians as well. A descending parachute rarely went unnoticed. They found Kirkland gathering what little equipment remained and preparing for whatever came next. But resistance was impossible. Against armed men, a lone pilot had no realistic chance. The capture followed a pattern repeated countless times across Europe. At first there was rough handling. Years of bombing had left deep resentment among the German population. Many civilians had lost homes or family members to the air war. Then military discipline returned. The prisoner had value. He would be processed according to established procedures. Edward Kirkland had now entered the same system that had absorbed thousands of Allied airmen before him. His survival gear was taken. His identification recorded. His freedom removed. But one thing remained untouched: his ability to think. Even as guards surrounded him and the reality of captivity settled in, his mind continued to work the problem. He watched. He listened. He began studying the system he had entered. The German prisoner handling network operated with something close to industrial efficiency. Captured airmen were usually transferred through Dulag Luft, the main interrogation center near Frankfurt. There, intelligence officers specialized in questioning Allied flyers. Their methods rarely involved violence. Instead, they relied on conversation, friendly questions, casual discussions, small details that seemed harmless but could reveal critical information about units, aircraft, and tactics. Kirkland gave them nothing beyond what the Geneva Convention required: name, rank, service number, date of birth, nothing more. But the interrogation officers were not the only observers. The guards who managed prisoner transport had also developed expectations after handling thousands of airmen. American pilots, they believed, were predictable. They complained loudly about food. They formed tight groups with men from their own units. They talked openly about escape, but rarely attempted it. And the few who did try escape often betrayed themselves through obvious behavior. Watching the fences too closely, hoarding supplies, speaking quietly in corners. Trained guards learned to recognize these patterns quickly. What the guards expected above all was compliance. The logic seemed unavoidable. A lone prisoner far from Allied lines, surrounded by enemies and lacking supplies, would eventually accept the reality of captivity. He would wait. He would hope. He would survive until the war ended. This belief had become so deeply embedded in the German system that it was no longer questioned. It was simply assumed. Like gravity, like daylight. The facilities holding Kirkland reflected that assumption. Security focused on preventing large, organized escapes. Tunnels mass breakouts. Coordinated prisoner revolts. Everything was designed to stop groups. What the system was not designed to stop was something else entirely. One man, acting alone. To the guards watching him, Kirkland appeared exactly like every other captured pilot. He followed instructions. He ate the food provided. He answered to his name during roll call. He showed no obvious signs of rebellion. But beneath the calm exterior, his mind remained active. He was mapping everything around him. Guard rotations. Moments when attention faded. Points where routines became automatic. Details that most prisoners ignored. While the Germans believed the situation had already been decided, Edward Kirkland was still calculating. The German transit system moved captured Allied airmen through carefully controlled stages. Each stage had a purpose. First, remove the shock of combat and replace it with routine. Then isolate the prisoner from any sense of momentum or initiative. Then move him deeper into the machinery of captivity until the idea of escape began to feel less like a plan and more like a fantasy. With every transfer, the opportunities narrowed. Security tightened. Guards became more familiar with the faces under their control. The window for action, if it existed at all, was small, and it was closing. Most prisoners sensed this without ever fully admitting it to themselves. They understood the risks. They understood the probabilities. They understood that each passing day made freedom less likely and punishment more certain. So they did what reason told them to do. They waited. Edward Kirkland looked at the same mathematics and reached a different conclusion. He understood the odds perfectly. He knew how low the probability of success was. He knew what recapture could mean. What he had also recognized, however, was something the Germans themselves no longer saw. Their entire system depended on certainty. Every checkpoint, every guard post, every search procedure, every locked door, all of it was built on the assumption that some actions were impossible because they were irrational. That certainty created blind spots. The Germans knew how to spot tunnel diggers. They knew how to break up groups whispering over coordinated plans. They knew how to read the obvious signs of resistance in a prisoner's face and posture. What they did not know how to defend against was a man acting alone, without warning, in a moment so ordinary that nobody believed observation was even necessary. Kirkland waited. He watched. He studied the rhythm of captivity the way he had once studied the movement of enemy fighters in the sky. He was no longer scanning clouds and contrails. Now he was scanning doors, hallways, guard habits, moments of inattention. He was looking for the instant when certainty would become weakness. The first escape came through a gap that existed only because no one believed it could be used. The exact details have been lost. Records from late 1944 are fragmented, scattered, or destroyed by the collapse of the Reich. But the essential truth remains. Kirkland identified an opportunity that his guards could not even imagine as dangerous, and he acted before hesitation could stop him. It may have happened during a transfer. Movement between facilities created brief stretches of vulnerability. Security often relied less on direct observation than on procedure itself. A man who moved at the right moment, with enough confidence, might create several seconds of freedom before anyone even realized that procedure had failed. Or it may have been an unguarded access point. By late 1944, the German prison system was under strain. Facilities meant for smaller numbers now held too many men. Guard details were thinner than they should have been. Somewhere in that overstretched network, a barrier that should have been watched was not. Whatever the exact mechanism, The result was extraordinary. Kirkland crossed from inside the system to outside it, from prisoner to fugitive, from counted and controlled to suddenly, dangerously free. The transition itself took only seconds. The silence that followed was the most valuable thing he possessed. No alarms yet. No shouts. No running footsteps. The guards continued their routines because they had not yet understood that routine had been broken. Other prisoners, if they saw him go, said nothing. The machinery of captivity kept moving on the assumption that everything was normal. Kirkland used that silence the way a combat pilot used cloud cover. Every second of confusion was distance. Every moment before the alarm meant one more chance to become difficult to find. When the alarm finally came, the German response followed its established pattern. Search parties, military police alerts, messages to nearby civilian authorities. Roads watched, routes closed. The system activated quickly, but it was built on assumptions about how a fleeing prisoner would behave. He would seek shelter. He would move only at night. He would try to find a resistance contact or drift toward neutral territory. Search procedures were designed around those expectations. What Kirkland did in the following hours and days is harder to reconstruct. What is clear is this: the freedom he gained did not last. Hostile territory was more dangerous than courage alone could overcome. He had no food source worth relying on, no local knowledge, no winter shelter he could trust. Every village carried the risk of betrayal. Every delay weakened him physically. Like most evaders before him, he was eventually recaptured not through one dramatic mistake, but through the slow accumulation of disadvantages. Cold, hunger, exhaustion, bad luck. German authorities reclaimed their prisoner. The system swallowed him again. After the first escape, everything changed. The guards watched him differently now. His name no longer passed through the system as just another captured American flyer. He was marked. A problem. An embarrassment. Proof that their assumptions had failed. Surveillance increased. Restrictions tightened. His movements were more limited. But the Germans made one critical mistake. They treated the first escape as an isolated anomaly. They believed a specific gap had allowed it, and once that gap was closed, the danger was over. They did not understand the real cause. The real cause had not been the gap. It had been the man. The mind that kept calculating long after calculation seemed pointless. The refusal to accept that bad odds required passivity. The recognition that any system built on certainty always contains hidden weaknesses. Kirkland endured the tighter controls. He accepted the new scrutiny. He gave every outward sign of a man who had learned his lesson. The guards believed they were watching resignation settle over him. In reality, he was learning something else entirely. The first escape had given him data. It had shown him what worked. It had shown him what did not. It had exposed the speed and structure of the German response. It had revealed how the authorities thought. Most prisoners who survived recapture drew the obvious conclusion. They had used up their chance. They would not get another. Kirkland drew a different conclusion. He had come closer to freedom than most prisoners ever would. That meant the impossible was not impossible. It simply required correction. The factors that had led to recapture could be identified, studied, adjusted for. The second escape would need a different shape. He was now a flag prisoner. Guards knew his face. His file likely carried some notation marking him as an escape risk. The invisibility of the average prisoner was gone. But even that had an upside. Men who believe they understand a threat look for specific signs. They watch for hoarding, for whispering, for obvious coordination with other prisoners, for the visible habits that usually precede escape attempts. What they do not know how to monitor is the absence of those signs. A man who appears calm, a man who follows instructions, a man who seems to have accepted defeat. That kind of prisoner fades into routine again, even while being watched. And routine, Kirkland knew, was always where the cracks began. As 1944 turned into 1945, the war itself began to damage the German systems from the outside. The Reich was shrinking. The Soviets were advancing from the east. The Western Allies were driving from the west. Rail lines were damaged. Communications were strained. Resources once available for prisoner management were redirected toward survival at the front. The consequences reached the camps and transit routes. Guard detachments were reduced. Schedules changed unexpectedly. Facilities meant for long-term control became temporary holding points in a larger movement of prisoners away from advancing armies. The smooth machinery Kirkland had first entered was beginning to shake itself apart. He watched the breakdown the same way he had watched everything else. Fatigue in the faces of guards. Disruptions in routines that had once seemed mechanical. Moments where procedure gave way to improvisation. Those were the moments he trusted most. Because improvisation is where systems reveal what they were never built to handle. And then, during another transfer, the opportunity finally appeared. By the final months of the war, Germany itself was beginning to unravel. The Reich that had once controlled nearly all of Europe was shrinking rapidly under pressure from both directions. Soviet armies were advancing from the east. Allied forces pushed forward from the west. Rail networks were damaged. Communications were failing. Entire regions of Germany were becoming corridors of retreat rather than territory firmly controlled. Inside this collapsing structure, the German prisoner transfer system began to strain. Prisoners were moved constantly as camps were emptied ahead of advancing armies. Columns of captured soldiers and airmen were marched or transported across a country that no longer possessed the organization it once had. Groups became larger. Guard detachments became smaller. Checkpoints that once inspected every prisoner carefully sometimes waved entire groups through simply to clear the growing backlog. The assumption that prisoners would remain compliant, an assumption that had always been present, became even stronger as the resources needed to enforce control became weaker. It was within this increasingly chaotic environment that Edward Kirkland made his second escape. As with his first escape, the exact details are difficult to reconstruct. Records from the final months of the war are incomplete, and many documents were destroyed as Germany collapsed. What survives is the essential fact. Kirkland escaped again, but this time the war itself had changed the equation. Allied armies were now much closer. German patrol networks were stretched thin. Civilian attitudes were shifting as the outcome of the war became increasingly obvious. Where once nearly every village had represented a threat, now some civilians were less willing to turn in a fleeing American who might soon represent the winning side. The environment that had made his first escape so difficult had begun to weaken. Even so, the journey to safety was far from easy. Kirkland was still a lone man moving through hostile territory. He had no official support, no guaranteed shelter, no secure food supply. The countryside around him was filled with soldiers, refugees, and civilians all struggling through the final months of a collapsing nation. German authority still existed on paper, but in many places it had already begun to dissolve. Checkpoints remained. Patrols still operated. But the tight control that had once defined the German security system was gone. Kirkland moved carefully through this unstable landscape. He avoided roads where patrols were most likely to travel. He stayed away from villages unless necessity forced him to approach them. He moved with the caution of someone who understood that one mistake could erase everything he had accomplished. The skills he had learned as a combat pilot now served him in a completely different environment. Observation, patience, rapid decision-making, constant awareness of danger. These same abilities that once kept him alive in the sky were now keeping him alive on the ground. Exactly how long his evasion lasted is unclear, but eventually, the moment he had been working toward since the day of his capture finally arrived. Edward Kirkland reached Allied lines. For the second time since being shot down, he had escaped the German system. This time there would be no recapture. Once inside Allied territory, Kirkland entered another familiar process. Recovered airmen were routinely debriefed by intelligence officers who gathered information about German operations, prison camp conditions, and the territory through which the escapee had traveled. These interviews served multiple purposes. They documented the experiences of captured personnel. They provided intelligence about enemy procedures. And they helped future escapees by identifying patterns that could be exploited again. Kirkland's experience added valuable insight. 2 escapes from a system designed to prevent exactly that. A rare outcome that demonstrated something important about the structure of captivity itself. The German prisoner system had been built carefully by professionals. It worked, most of the time, against most prisoners. It relied on predictable human behavior. It assumed that individuals placed in impossible situations would eventually accept the logic of their circumstances. And usually they did. But the system could not fully defend itself against the outlier. The man who refused to accept that logic. The man who kept calculating long after calculation seemed pointless. The man who continued to search for weakness inside structures built on certainty. Kirkland was that kind of man. When the war finally ended, the system that had once held him disappeared almost overnight. Prison camps were liberated. German units surrendered. The guards who had watched over thousands of Allied airmen scattered back into civilian life or entered captivity themselves. The vast machine of wartime control collapsed along with the Reich that had built it. For Edward Kirkland, the end of the war meant a return to the United States and to a country that had changed while he was gone. Like millions of returning veterans, he passed through the administrative steps of demobilization, medical examinations, paperwork, discharge processing, then the gradual transition back into civilian life. In many ways, his story followed a familiar pattern. Men who had lived through extraordinary circumstances rarely spoke loudly about them afterward. Kirkland did not become a public figure. He did not tour the country telling stories of his escapes. He did not build a career around his wartime experiences. Instead, he returned quietly to ordinary life. Family, work, community. The same path followed by millions of veterans who had once carried enormous responsibilities and then returned to civilian life without seeking recognition. The official record preserved what mattered. 2 escapes from German captivity, 1 recapture, 1 successful evasion to Allied lines. A sequence of events that stood out even within the vast archives of wartime experiences. Historians studying prisoner escapes would later note cases like Kirkland's for what they revealed about the nature of captivity itself. Most famous escapes were organized operations involving dozens or even hundreds of prisoners. Tunnels, forged documents, months of planning. Kirkland's escapes were something else. Individual, improvised, driven by one man's refusal to accept that action was pointless. The German system had been designed to prevent exactly that. It had succeeded in thousands of cases. But statistical success is not the same as absolute control. Even the most carefully constructed systems contain assumptions, and assumptions can become vulnerabilities. Kirkland found those vulnerabilities, not through elaborate planning, not through dramatic heroics, but through a simple and stubborn habit. He never stopped thinking. Edward R. Kirkland flew his final combat mission over Germany in 1944. He spent time as a prisoner of the Reich. He escaped twice from systems designed to make escape impossible. He returned to Allied territory and eventually to the quiet civilian life that followed the war. The sky that had once nearly killed him became only a memory. The barbed wire that had held him vanished with the end of the war. The guards who had watched him disappeared into the defeated nation they once served. What remained was something less visible, but far more lasting. Proof that certainty can fail. Proof that systems can break. And proof that somewhere between probability and impossibility, there is always space for one determined man who refuses to stop looking for a way out.